And welcome to Lunch with Lincoln for Monday, September 27th, 2021. I am your host, Reed Galen. Today, my guest is Dr. Dominic Packer. He is a professor at Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and he has a new book out earlier this month called The Power of Us: Harnessing Our Shared Identities to Improve Performance, Increase Cooperation, and Promote Social Harmony. Along with his co-author, Jay Van Bavel of New York University. So, Dominic, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Reed. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I know that the book and your research goes into a lot of how people self-identify and the groups they put themselves in. But before we get into what we typically focus on, which is politics, give us a little overview of what you and Jay were exploring when you decided to write this book.
Sure. So fundamentally, what we're interested in is how the groups that people belong to can become part of their identities. Not every group you're part of does, but many do, whether it's the nation you're a citizen of, your political affiliation, a fan of a particular football team, the university you went to, the church you're part of. Right? All of these are groups that you're part of that can become part of who you are. And when that happens, it shifts things in you. It changes some of your preferences or goals. You start to become more oriented toward those groups. And what we find in our research and the research of many others is that it can affect everything from very basic perceptions, how you're making sense of other people around you, even what you taste and smell, all the way up through large-scale social processes like protest or leadership or even something like revolution. So we explore everything from low-level perception all the way through these very large-scale things in our book, including politics, of course.
So let me ask you this, though, because whether or not it's, let's say you're a member of the, Rotary in your town, you self-identify as someone who's got communities, sort of a community spirit, but you're also a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, right? And you also find, that, Italian food is your favorite. So I guess my question is there a determination on what will be a stronger indication of self-identity than others? I mean, if you're a Packers fan or a Steelers fan, right, you might wear green and gold or black and gold, right? But that doesn't preclude you from being a fan of something else not related to football. And it also doesn't mean that if your neighbor was a Chiefs fan that you wouldn't necessarily, avoid your neighbor, right?
Right. That's right. So, I mean, there's a ton of great points there. One of the things we talk about in the book early on is something called the 20 statements test, where psychologists sometimes use this to get at what is your identity. And it's very simple. All it involves is completing the phrase, I am 20 times. And what's interesting about that is no one has difficulty doing that. You can come up with 20 things that define you, and they're not even necessarily internally consistent with each other. And some will be personal traits like I'm organized or I'm smart, and some will be relationships. I'm a father or a daughter or a cousin, and others will be these groups. One of the key things about identity is that different parts of ourselves can come in and out of focus at different times. So even the same day, right? You wake up in the morning and you're one kind of role. Maybe it's a parent, you're trying to get the kids out the door. Then you're in the car on the way to work and you're listening to talk radio and it's your political identity that's hyper salient. And then you're at work and it's your professional identity. For me, it's as a psychologist and a professor. For a doctor, it's a doctor, and so on. All of these identities, as they come in and out of focus, shift the things we do, and largely in sort of compliance with or conformity to the norms of that identity. But a football game, the fan, be cheering and yelling and jeering and feeling emotions perhaps stronger than they'd ordinarily feel. But outside of that context, the football fan's not jeering at their neighbor, right?
Right. Well, we hope not.
Affiliates. Yeah. Well, we hope not. Usually not.
So it sort of sounds like we all have these, I'm not, please understand, I'm not making light of this, but we all have these sort of multiple personalities within us.
Sure.
And given your location, given your mood, given the stimuli, again, being at a football game or whatever, those different personalities sort of come to the fore depending on where it is you are, what it is you're doing.
That's right. Different contexts, different situations can bring them in and out of focus. And the working title for our book for a long time was Social Chameleons. This idea being that we all have these multiple personalities or multiple identities that allow us fundamentally to navigate life. Life is complicated. You have to be somewhat different in different situations. And these identities are a way in which our brains navigate that.
Right. So if you were at let's say if you were at you were at a state fair and you had to speak up while you were eating, you and your family are eating a hot dog or something, like, because you have to be heard, that's like normal there. But if you were at a restaurant and you just like started yelling at people at your table in an outrageous voice, like, that wouldn't be normal.
Absolutely. So we're very attuned to the norms of whatever context we're in.
But let me ask you this.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, especially to the norms of our groups. So it's not just any old norm. It's the norm of the people like me that I want to conform to.
Okay. Yeah. And so I want to talk about that before we dive a little bit more into politics in particular, because it seems to me and to us that this concept of norms is being twisted, expanded, retracted, whatever it is, that what was normal 10 years ago, right, or what was a norm 10 years ago seems to be, a lot of these things. Like, for example, if you're on an airplane and you're upset about something, 10 years ago, we didn't have 4,000 incidents, I don't assume, in a year of like people losing their minds on an airplane. Right. Now, that seems to be, it's still not normal, but there seems to be, some norm of someone gets on an aluminum tube at 35,000 feet in the air and now they decide they want to lose their shit. Like, is it all just back down to like, I don't believe in masks, I don't believe in vaccines, they're making me put a mask on and I'm pissed off and I'm part of this group and I'm stuck on here and I don't want to, just walk me through that, because I'm baffled by it.
I mean, I have to say I'm baffled by the behavior, maybe not the psychology of it. I think you're right. I think it has to do with norms of behavior, even on an airplane, now have become political. And that is new. And I think, so when political scientists talk about polarization, one of the things they describe it as a flattening. It's like you're taking all the richness of our identities and of all the things we're involved in and interested in and putting it into one dimension. Everything becomes about politics. Are you on the left or are you on the right? And that's a huge loss, I think, for the richness of life. But it also helps to explain why, even on an airplane, someone's political identity 20 years ago, irrelevant, except maybe in conversation with the person next to you. And now it's a thing, right? You're wearing a mask or not wearing a mask, you're signaling to the world something about who you are on that dimension. And it's leading to these incidents. And with regard to the norm piece of that, I think people follow norms, but they follow the norms they perceive, right? So it actually really matters what you think the norms are. And if you overestimate, for example, the prevalence of certain kinds of activities, it makes it more likely you might engage in them. So we see these news stories about people acting out in a grocery store or on an airplane. And if we're not careful, that can give this sort of false impression that they're actually much more common than they are. But that in turn becomes self-fulfilling. People then might be more likely to do that themselves because they think, oh, this is the new normal. This is what people are doing, when in fact, it's actually still pretty abnormal.
Right. We even have a phrase, right? It's Karens, right? We have maybe not everyone uses that, but it seems to be something that has sort of spread through popular culture, that someone who goes into a big box store and throws a fit is a Karen, right? Like, we've named it. We've named the abnormality.
Sure. Yeah. Right. And I think that naming, especially in a pejorative sense, is a reaction to that. Right? It's a sort of challenging, like, let's not let this become a norm. In some ways, what's going on in our groups is continual contestation and debate about what should our norms be. And so when people see other people behaving badly and push back on it and say you're being a Karen, or in other ways sort of make fun of it or try to stamp it out, they're trying to enforce either existing norms or discourage the emergence of new ones.
So let me switch quickly to politics more specifically. So, you talk about polarization, and as someone who spent most of his career, if not his life, in politics, if you're looking at a congressional race, right, one that has the ability to go either way, that there's 40% of the people who are almost assuredly going to vote against you, 40% of the people who are almost assuredly going to vote for you. Let's say 5% on either end who are leaning your way, and then you've got the 10% of the middle who you've got to convince, right? And of those, probably 5%, total are gettable in either way. So the electoral math piece of this has always been dividing people by how you see their likelihood to do what you want them to do, or take an action you don't want them to do. But now, and even then though, probably the Venn diagram of those people was pretty close, right? Your average Republican and your average Democrat, probably shared beliefs on, 60 or 70% of things, but it was those particular issues, whether they were national or local, were the things that really pushed people to one candidate or another. And it very well could have been just that they had an R or a D behind their name, which is still a massive driver of a lot of this stuff, right? As much as we want to believe believe otherwise. But now, to your point, politics has become identity. I support Donald Trump. I oppose Donald Trump. I am a Republican. I am a Democrat. I'm a progressive. I'm a conservative. I'm a 100% vaccine mandate person. I'm an anti-vaxxer. I think everyone should wear a mask all the time. No one should ever have to wear a mask because it's intruding on my freedom. Everything, to your point, is put through this prism. So in your research, was this, is it like nothing happened and then everything happened at once first? And then second, is there a way back out of this?
Great questions. So I think we would argue things have gotten worse in the sense of becoming more polarized, especially with regard to what's called affective polarization, which is our feelings toward each other. So opinion polls, for example, dating back to the 1970s, have asked people how they feel about their own political party and members of the other political party. And what's largely stable over that time is positive feelings toward your own. Not super positive, actually, for most people. So we're pretty good. But what's changed dramatically is the negative feelings people have toward the other side. Whereas it used to be people felt pretty neutral. Like, I like my side better, but they're okay. They're fine. They're not, enemies per se. That's
sort of an out of sight, out of mind thing.
Out of sight, out of mind. It's like, I prefer my side. If I'm going to vote, I'm going to vote my way, but I don't regard them as a mortal threat, for example. And what we're seeing is that those feelings of negativity toward the other side have only grown. And in fact, the polling suggests that those are now stronger than the liking for your own side. And I think you can sense this with some voters, that it's really an oppositional vote. Like, I'm not voting because I like this party, but I'm voting against Trump or against Hillary or against whoever, I don't like. And so that has changed. We don't think that this is like a fundamental change in human psychology. These are group dynamics, and this can happen, especially when elites and leaders use divisiveness to mobilize their own supporters. And I think that's a big part of the story here. Is that over time, and social media has certainly enabled this, elites and leaders have mobilized their own side against the other side. So you don't have to like my policies, but you better vote for me because they are worse.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, we have conversations with otherwise perfectly reasonable Republicans all the time, right? I was a Republican for many years, which is, yeah, look, I understand what you're saying. I even agree with you. Right. I don't like Trump. I don't like my own party. Maybe I've re-registered as an independent, but let me tell you something, like, the Democrats scare the hell out of me. Right. And most of what you see is driven by what you said, either social media, preconceived notions, Fox News, whatever it is, that they don't necessarily know that the Democrats will do anything worse, or frankly, even if something the Democrats did would affect them negatively. It's just the idea of, like, I can't do it. I just can't do it.
Right. And along with that, a sort of willingness to disbelieve, or to believe, I should say, disinformation about the other side. And we and others have done interesting research on this issue. Whereas if you give people fake news, essentially, they're much more prone to want to believe it and to share it on social media if it's fake news that makes the other side look bad, or it's fake news that makes their side look good. And that's not just a Republican phenomena or right-wing phenomena. It also happens on the left. I mean, both sides are doing it. And what's in some ways really frustrating about this is, as much as we have this affective polarization, this increasing dislike and concern about and disdain for the other side, if you actually look at, as you said earlier, policy issues, what do people really think about specific things with regard to healthcare, or even contested issues like gun control or abortion, the left and the right in America are often much more on the same page than they think they are.
Right.
They often dramatically overestimate the differences between them, which is bad because it means then you're not in any way open to hearing what the other side has to say. You're not going to have those conversations.
Well, speaking of having conversations, we got an audience question here. Georgia on YouTube asks, my family is polarized. I'm trying to rise above it when we interact and not take the bait. What are your recommendations for family interactions like this?
I mean, it's really hard in families, right? Because these are people you love. And I think for me, my fundamental piece of advice is to remember that. Remember that you have more than a political identity, right? That you have a family identity and that matters to you. And that's one of the reasons to try to maintain that relationship. It doesn't mean you shouldn't tell people about your concerns, but try to frame it in a way that, has your relationship to them at the heart of it. Like I'm talking to you about this issue because I'm worried about you, or because I think you should get the vaccine because I care about you and your health. And these are really difficult conversations that people are having a great deal right now. I mean, on an optimistic note, research looking at the effects of these sorts of conversations suggests that they can help. That if you actually do engage with people on the other side, those conversations often cause people subsequently to feel a little less negative and to feel a little more open to some of the ideas they might encounter from.
And is that because, there's this whole thing about, people want to feel heard, that there's a lot of grievance going on. They don't feel seen. They don't feel heard. They feel belittled. So what are you saying is that if you're talking to someone with whom you vehemently disagree politically, but you're doing it in a way that does not, look, if you scream at anyone, you're an idiot. Right.
You're not going to
they're unlikely to have a conversation with you. I get that. But what you're saying is that just by that nature of willingness to have a conversation, it throttles back on the sort of defensive nature, the energy that because they're probably just ramping themselves up, right? As they think that you're going to come after them, all of their defensive mechanisms internally are switching on.
That's right. If it's an argument, then inevitably people are defensive and they're not necessarily listening to what you have to say. They're just counter arguing it and trying to get their own point in. And I think so. Research on intergroup relations, how do you improve relations between groups that are in conflict with one another, finds that one of the best strategies for doing that is to find some piece of common ground, right? Some common goal that we both have that we need to work together to achieve. And when we can find that, it doesn't mean we have to agree on everything or nearly anything, but we at least have one thing we can work toward. And with your family member, I would say it's the same thing. Like, what within our family are we trying to do? Like, let's try and forget about politics for 5 minutes and collectively work on something else.
So to that end, finding the one thing, that you could agree on, as we talked about right before we went on, there's a story in the New York Times this morning, David Leonhardt's morning report, that the polarization politically is determining the levels of vaccinations, levels of COVID infections and COVID deaths by county in the United States. And those counties that voted for Biden have lower rates of all of those things. And those counties that voted for Trump, and the more overwhelmingly they did, the less they're being vaccinated and the more they're getting sick and dying. How is it that we can't communicate across ideological lines to say, we don't want you to die. That's why we would like you to get vaccinated.
Right. I mean, I think this is the biggest tragedy of the pandemic, especially in the United States, is that it became attached to politics. It didn't have to, and it hasn't everywhere. So I think the same article notes that there are other nations where you have strong political divisions between the left and the right, but it hasn't, the pandemic itself hasn't become politicized. So you're not seeing these discrepancies in vaccination rates. This emerged super early in the United States with the pandemic. So my co-author, Jay Van Bavel, with a colleagues, did research super early in the pandemic. I think it was from about May of 2020, where they looked at GPS data from, I believe it was about 20 million cell phones in the United States to see as the country went into lockdown mode, or at least people were being encouraged to go out less and to social distance more, to what extent did people stop moving around, as indicated by their phones? And what they found, same pattern, even back then, that counties that had voted for Trump in 2016 were much less likely to reduce their movements than counties that had voted for Clinton in 2016. And then that change in movement data subsequently predicted mortality. So the counties where people kept moving around later on had higher death rates. So this emerged super early, and at least in part, it's again the behavior of elites and leadership on either side. And I think there were especially early on, missed opportunities for the Trump administration to make it clear, like, we're taking this really seriously, and we don't care if you're left or right. Like, let's all get together on this. And countries that managed to do that and rally around a national identity instead of a political identity have subsequently ended up coping a lot better with it and have higher vaccination rates and less mortality.
Well, and I mean, we remember going back to last year, there was a meeting somewhere in the White House, right? A very banal meeting in a, around a desk or around a table with coffee and pastries. And at that meeting, Jared Kushner said, "Let the blue states get sick." Right? Like that's,
right.
I mean, that's a failure of leadership and humanity and everything else. But to your point, once those in charge started seeing this as not a public health emergency, but one where can we score points on the politics of it? We end up where we are now.
That's right. I think, this pandemic, the spread of a virus is a very multifaceted thing, right? So early on, there were much higher caseloads in blue states, and largely driven just by cities, right? Where you have more people,
right,
especially more people coming and going, you're going to have more spread. That's how viruses spread. But the other part of coping with the pandemic is behavior, right? It's if you change how people behave, whether it's by putting on a mask or getting a vaccine or locking down if you need to, you reduce that spread. And so what we've seen over time is a shift from it being afflicting blue states, especially in cities, to now afflicting, the red states and especially the red counties. And it's not because the virus spreads more easily there. It's because behavior hasn't adapted or changed in ways that stop it from spreading.
So, and just, on that front, you have governors like Jim Justice in West Virginia, Asa Hutchinson in Arkansas, even Kay Ivey in Alabama, who are saying, like, this is common sense. Jim Justice is as West Virginia as he could be, right? He's got the accent, he's got the look, and he's like, this is common sense, y'all. Right. Get vaccinated. So, like, some of these Republicans, even very conservatives, are coming across the line. But I guess, again, it's still hard for me, and maybe this speaks to my lack of imagination or lack of open-mindedness. I'm going to take that with a big grain of salt. Is like, we're not talking about, where you park your car, right? We're not talking about where you get your groceries. We're talking about whether or not you're going to die. And I'm just baffled by it.
I mean, I have to be honest, baffled by it too, because it does just make sense. But I think it speaks to the power of an identity to cause people to not do what makes sense. And I think what's happened in the current political context we're in is that the Republicans and the Democrats, especially I think on the Republican side, have ceased to define themselves so much by who we are, but more by who we're not. So we are not you, we are not them. So if vaccines or social distancing, you can't tell us what to do. And what you're doing, we suspect, is probably a leftist plot. So therefore, we have to do the opposite. And I think you can see that this has tied people into knots. So the ivermectin, people taking this medication, which isn't just for horses, but is clearly not medically, there's no evidence that it's efficacious against COVID-19.
Well, let's be clear, in the doses they're talking about, it's really only good for livestock.
Sure. So people are taking this against all medical advice, against what they must at some level know is sensible. But I think it's because you've talked yourself out of being able to take a vaccine, because even though it seems to work, that's a Democrat thing, or that would be being a bad Republican or a bad Trump supporter if I were to do that. Yet COVID is still very scary. Like it could kill me. It could kill my family. And so that's why I think people are so desperate to find a solution that isn't a solution, but that's why they're so, it's resonating so much.
Well, and as you noted again before we went on, that I don't remember exactly when it was, but it was one of Trump's rallies, I don't know, a month or two ago, where he said, go out, you got to get vaccinated, go get vaccinated. The whole place booed him, and he sort of backed off immediately. Said, all right, well, you're going to do what you're going to do. Of course, he's been vaccinated. And be clear, the guy's he might be the narcissist of all time until we find somebody worse, God forbid. But even now, when someone asked about, whether or not he would get the booster, he said no, which is also a lie. He absolutely, if he hasn't already gotten it, he will. But now we're back into that political place, which is he recognized, he's always got a very good nose for where his base is, that they didn't like it when he talked about that. So he backed off. And now it's like, well, if you don't want to get the booster, it's on you.
Right. So one of the things we talk about in the book and have a whole chapter on it is leadership. And looking at leadership through the lens of social identities helps us understand a few things. One of which is that the people we often want as leaders and are most likely to follow, especially enthusiastically, we regard as good group members. They're really one of us. In fact, that's often what gives leaders their power. We only follow the people we think are one of us. Mm-hmm. And Trump's an interesting character in how he's been able to fashion an identity around that and around himself. But what that booing instant illustrates is there's limits even to his ability to structure it around himself. That if you've defined us as anti-vaccine or we're not worried about COVID, then you, even as the leader, can't step over that line without getting booed. Wait, right. You're not, that's not how we behave. Are you saying you're not one of us? Are you saying you're a secret Democrat? That said, I do think if he were to stand up and just be consistent and say, get a vaccine, get a vaccine, get a vaccine, it would save huge numbers of lives because he still has extraordinary influence.
No, well, we've seen that. And unfortunately, when the opportunity arises, he always takes the bad path. Always. That's never any case. So tell us, in our last couple of minutes here, tell us a couple of other interesting things you all learned during your research for the book.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things we talk a bit about is the psychology of dissent. And I'm very interested in when will people challenge the norms of the groups they're part of. And I think the Lincoln Project is an interesting example of it. Or when will Liz Cheney, when will a Liz Cheney emerge and challenge her political party, or Mitt Romney vote for impeachment? And one of the things we find is that somewhat counterintuitively, it's often the most identified group members who are the most willing to do that. Ordinarily, identified group members conform because they like what their groups are doing. But if they come to disagree with their groups and see it as immoral or unproductive or unethical, they're actually more likely than other people to stand up because they care and they're willing to take the social costs and the professional hit that can entail, which I think is a really important lesson for all of us, whether it's in politics or organizations or just day-to-day life.
Well, and I think it's interesting when you mention Cheney, because here's the thing is that whether you like her or not, Cheney is by far more conservative than most of the Republican conference in the context of an old conservatism, right? That doesn't probably exist writ large anymore. And so to your point, she said, I do believe in the Constitution. I do believe in the rule of law. I do believe in right and wrong. Most of my other colleagues in this conference don't, because they're all about themselves. They're all about, how do I get reelected? Now, maybe it's because she came from, she's Dick Cheney's daughter. She's Lynn Cheney's daughter. She's been in this her whole life, right? So she has a very defined personal identity that probably is very comforting to her, right? And probably hugely uncomfortable to a lot of her colleagues, because they all know, at least the 100 or so who should know better, what's going on. But of course, none of them have the moral compass with which to do anything about it.
Right. Now she's got a set of principles. And I think, so we call the book The Power of Us because these identities are very powerful and can have a lot of good consequences, which we haven't talked so much about today, but can also have these bad effects. And one of the powerful things to be wary of is how they can push you out of doing what makes sense, right? Or push you out or away from the principles you thought you held. And it's good to step back from that and say, well, wait a second, is my dislike for the other side worth sacrificing these principles I have? Maybe not. Maybe my principles should come first, and I might actually have to work with them, who I don't particularly like, but my principles matter more than this identity.
Well, and I'll say this is that's on our side, when we start to build coalition, members, we say that a lot, which is, you may not like us, you may not like, we might have fought one another politically in the past, but in this moment in time, we share a very big goal, a very big objective, and for now, we put our, look, as you said, like, we put our side, none of us are Republicans anymore, but we put that aside. And, we're not a policy organization. We're a pro-democracy organization. And that's when we ask people to work with us. That's what we want, which is in this moment, let's lock arms for this big thing, because from this big thing, all other big things flow. All right. Well, Dominic, thank you so much. Again, guys, the book is called The Power of Us: Harnessing Our Shared Identities to Improve Performance, Increase Cooperation, and Promote Social Harmony. I'm sure you can find it at Amazon or your local bookseller or wherever fine books are sold. Dominic, thanks for joining me. Everybody out there, thanks for joining me for Lunch with Lincoln, and we will see you Friday.